Hello and welcome to Coach Kyle's most misunderstood topic of the week, which this time was CSS layout. Why wouldn't you be confused by it? It's really complicated. This is probably the part that trips people up the most about CSS. Typography, there's kind of a lot going on with it, but it's not especially complex. Colors, like wrapping your head around the different color models, that's kind of tricky too, but it generally locks in fairly quickly. Sometimes people never really get CSS layout. I want to just get a list of questions going to start with, and then I want to explore some of the different layout options that we have, and then maybe we'll push some boxes around a screen. So let's start with some questions. There we go. What are your burning questions about CSS layout right now?
I froze. After I got the index done, I'm like, okay, now where? It's like I didn't know where to start and how, but once I got started, I was fine. But it's like I freeze.
Okay.
It's like, okay, where do I go?
I watched you do the grid yesterday. That wasn't terrible. I mean, I thought that all made a lot of sense. And then the grid garden, like legit just, I'm glad that mine is not a grid, even though I watched you do it, because there was too much, like when it was like counting the lines versus counting the boxes. And I feel like it became very complicated when it wasn't when I watched you do it.
Sure.
So that would be more if you could clarify the grid.
Yeah, totally.
In general.
I heard Tiffany's as like kind of macro layout stuff. So if we're starting from the big problem and trying to break it down into small problems, that's usually where that freeze happens. You're like, all right, well, how do I turn the big problem into a small problem? So that's macro layout. And then I think it was Julie was talking about grid. Just another overview of grid. Other layout questions y'all have?
My biggest problem is figuring out which container to apply the style to, grid or Plex. Earlier, I had one going that when I applied it to the parent container, it didn't apply the style. So I ended up having to do it for each item in order to get it to apply the style. But yeah, that's my biggest question.
Sure.
The parent container.
Container versus item. Other layout questions. Keep them coming.
When to use padding versus margin versus width 50% versus height X%.
Box model breakdown. I got answers for you. Cool. What else?
I'm having a hard time. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, please go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I'm having a hard time. I understand how to do the grid layout. I've got that down. But once I put content into each individual grid, it just, I don't know how to manipulate it. Like if I want it to be centered or to the right or to the left or down the middle, I just can't move the stuff around the way I want.
I call that alignment. Excellent. Keep them coming.
This might be a one-off question, but how many boxes can we get inside of a box?
Sure.
Right. So what's the amount of containers can we create, and how much manipulation do we get inside of each of those containers?
Cool. What else?
Maybe just best practices, just because it works doesn't mean you should do it.
Sure.
Or if there's any common, this is what you should be looking for or not.
Okay, love it. These are great. Keep them coming. Anything else?
I don't know if this is about layout, but can you use more than one font? I've imported more than one so far, and it seems to be working okay.
Yep. No limit to the number of fonts you can have. It's not a
Okay.
layout question, but at least it's easy to answer.
Thank you.
Cool. All right,
And I
go ahead.
brought this up earlier with the images. When I have a big image, I'm not able to shrink it down to stay within the container. When I have a small image, I can't expand it. I don't know.
So check that link that I posted like half an hour ago. I wrote a whole new topic article for you on all the ways you can do that.
Sounds good.
All right. Let's dig in. This is pretty good meal. All right, so let's first do like an overview of our toolbox. So what tools do we have to place things on the page? Shout them out.
What do you mean?
So,
Like a div or?
Nope. Think
Okay.
like CSS stuff. What CSS
Oh,
properties do we have that allow us to place things places?
flex.
Flex.
Display grid.
Grid.
Block and inline.
Block and inline. What else?
Positioning like relative and absolute.
Beautiful. Positioning. If these are the only things that you know, that gets you pretty far. I'd say this covers a good 95% of what you want to do with layout. So block and inline, those are pretty easy. Not always easy to do what you want with them, but inline stuff just keeps going one after the other, just like sentences do. And if they get to the end, they start wrapping around. Like if you want it to kind of work the way that text does, that's inline. And then if you have something block, makes a new line, takes up all the space, you can have a bunch of block stuff. If you try to put another block thing after an inline thing, puts it there. Questions about how the inline and block display modes work? Cool. So flex and grid work a little bit differently. So I mentioned yesterday that like, hey, all this stuff was sort of based around the idea of sharing academic research papers. So like when we talk about a document, it's not like a rich metaphor or something like that. They were literally supposed to be documents, but now we use them as applications. Flex and grid were designed to give us the kind of control that we need for layout and applications. So both of them use the concept of children and containers. Here's the most common misconception about children and containers. Actually, I'm going to make these different colors. Nope. So if I have one container and it's got 2 children, and each of those has 2 children. If I make the blue box flex or grid, it is flexing or gridding the green boxes. It has absolutely no effect on the red boxes. If I want them to be a part of the same flexy, gritty kind of thing, I need to start it all over again. So like if this is a grid, then the green boxes are grid items. If I want to put the red boxes on a grid, then I also need to make those grids. So the exact same element can be a grid item and a grid container. Same thing with flex.
That
that's the
answers
thing
my
that
Put
throws
a
people off.
flex.
What was it?
Could you put a flex container or a flex box inside of a grid container?
Absolutely.
Just out of curiosity.
You can totally do that. Something can be a grid item and a flex container. Not a problem.
And I assume the reverse would be true too, but it's always just direct children who the container applies to.
It is a parent immediate child relationship only for both of them.
This might come down to personal preference, but is there a better way of doing that kind of stacking? Is it more proper to say grid first, flex second, or vice versa?
No. They solve a similar problem in very different ways. So
the reading said that large container or large, if you're doing a whole lot, you should use a grid, where like the flexes should be used for smaller. So do you agree with that, or is that?
I mean, I wrote it, so yeah.
Was that your? Oh, I thought that was the one that was linked. Sorry.
It might have been. So, like in general, that's a pretty good guideline. That grid tends to be a better tool for macro, big picture layout. Flex tends to work a little bit better for smaller layout things, but like that is a very rough generalization. You can do grid on teeny tiny little things, and like there's great cases for that. You can do flex on massive stuff. For example, on the Sika site, like this whole column for the content, that's flexed. So this column is flex, and that's a pretty macro layout, but I have it as a flexed column here. Could it have been a grid? Yeah, it probably would have worked more or less the same. I find that grids are a little bit heavier weight because you need to define the columns and the rows and stuff ahead of time. If it's just going to be like, I mean, that's one column and one row. That doesn't make a ton of sense to put into a grid, but that's totally reasonable for flexing something. Yeah, when grid came out, so like these didn't come out at the same time. Flex predated grid by 2 or 3 years. And there was a lot of people who were like, oh, thank God, we don't have to use flex anymore. We finally have grid to replace it. And you'll see that in a lot of the technologies that we do in this program, is that there's like a naive perception that grid was like an upgrade from flex or a replacement for it. It's super not true. They just do different kinds of things. But there are a lot of scenarios, like Venn diagram on this, like only something that could only be done with grid and like could only be done by flex. There's a fair amount of overlap where you could use either tool. And so one of my heuristics is it one row, one column? That's probably not a grid. That's probably something like flex. Or am I doing something like I just want evenly spaced stuff, or I just want to push things out to the side, or I'm just trying to center something? That's flex. You don't need a grid for that. Meanwhile, am I trying to do a macro layout? Like, an example that would be something like that's the page, and I'm trying to do a macro layout that has that and a sidebar and main content and a footer. You kind of can't do that with flex, like not easily. That is like a trivial problem for grid. So I'd probably use it. So like that's a grid problem. If I have, this is a container and I want the items in it to be spaced out like that, that's a flex problem. That'd be ridiculous to do in a grid. Flex containers, flex children. Grid containers, grid children. It's a one-to-one relationship. Parent, immediate child, not grandchildren. And then when you use grid versus when you use flex is the problem easily imagined as a grid? Or is it more, I want to lay out a row or a column of things and have a little bit more control than I have with just block and inline about how they're spaced out, where they're positioned, that kind of stuff. That's grid versus flexbox. Questions?
This would all been super handy to know during, the first website when we had to get into this.
But you wouldn't be able to take any of this in.
That's true.
So I love this story. So the first time I taught JavaScript promises, that's a tricky concept that we're doing in a couple weeks. I started off by saying a JavaScript promise represents an eventual value. And then we wrestled with JavaScript promises for like a week. And then some student comes in at stand up and goes, "Oh my God, Andy finally made it click for me. He told me that a promise represents an eventual value." And then just everything is like, "Oh yeah, of course. So maybe next time you want to start with that." And I almost table flipped. I was like, I can go back to the video. It's the very first thing I said. But a lot of this is just getting your ears and your eyes ready to take something new in. So I don't think that, I think struggling with flex and grid problems on that project is why I'm more confident that all of you are going to pick this up now. All right, let's take a look at it in action. So flex and grid stuff I think is in 3. Cool. That's not a grid. That's like 5 boxes in a line. It could be a horizontal line, it could be a vertical line. That's not really a grid. Especially if you consider, if I have a 6th box, where does it go? Does this keep growing? Can it be smaller than this? Are these products or user profile kind of thing? In that case, it's not a grid because where would the new things go on the grid? Grids, you generally are defining the cells for that grid ahead of time. If that wouldn't make any sense to do, probably better off with flex. This was the very first thing that everybody lost their minds about when Flexbox came out, because it used to be incredibly difficult to vertically center something in an element, and absolutely trivial with Flexbox. And I think this is a Flexbox only idea. That you have a primary axis and a cross axis, but you can flip them. And the real thing I'm looking for is this buddy. Let's shuffle some of these around. Feel free to pull up this file. I'll throw it in Zoom chat. Save you a click. Let's check out what's going on here. So across the middle of this, I keep trying to use Vim commands. All right, so this list here, let's take a look at the HTML. So it's a UL with 5 list items in it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So list is their parent. That's the UL. The UL, 5 LIs as kids. And then everything below this doesn't matter. So I said, I want this container to be flexed. I want it to be a row. And I want it justify content center, align item center. So that means going across here, that's the primary axis because flex direction is row. Align items makes it vertically centered. And justify content, it's a little hard to see because they're all pushed together, but you can see the spaces around the side. If I make this bigger, justify content center is trying to push all of those into the middle. So if I did, instead of justify content center, if I did the space between, check out what changes. And save. And then there we go. So pushes them out from each other. If I did justify content flex start, that pushes them all to the left. If I do flex end, pushes them all to the right. Center, jams them all together in the middle again. Align items works the exact same way. So I save that. All right, these are all jammed in the center. If I set the align items to flex start, pushes them all up to the top. If I say flex end, pushes them all down to the bottom. Center, jams them all in the middle. Now, one of the things you can do with Flexbox, so like there's these ones that are pinned there and don't move. You can override the alignment on an item. You cannot change the justification of an item, but you can change its alignment. So remember, justification is primary axis, so that's left to right on this. Up and down by default is the cross axis. So we can override our align item center and make those whatever we want them to be. So in this case, they're flex start, flex end. If I got rid of those, then they're all in the middle. If I put them back, there we go. If I change the flex direction from row to column, the entire thing just rotates 90 degrees. Otherwise, works exactly the same. That's like bread and butter Flexbox. Do that day in, day out. Ask me some questions about it.
Do you have an easy way to remember, like, align items and align content? Like those, I don't keep those straight at all. I just full screw with it until it works. Is there like an easy way to remember, or is there something that actually is gonna, I don't know, sink in? I don't know. For some reason, those two, I just align text or align whatever.
Oh, align items like that.
Items versus content. Yeah.
No, you just memorize them. There's no like a system for it or anything. Justify content, align items. Now, Flex and Grid both use both of those.
Yeah.
So maybe that helps. But you align the items, you justify the content. Another way to think of it maybe is that since we know that this is a Flex container and these are Flex items, items are the thing that you can override. So that's your cross axis. Align self is always going to be overriding the item. Maybe that's helpful. But yeah, some of this stuff is kind of arbitrary. You just memorize it.
When we're setting up the attribute and rule that we're going to be establishing a flex, Emmet has the flex and flex box, which will both autofill. Now, is there a difference in these attributes between differentiating a flex and a flex box? Because it seems like we're using them interchangeably here.
You mean like the term or like a value for the display thing?
The value right there, yeah. So if we go into the value and we say
do flex box. Oh yeah, don't do that.
Yeah.
I think that was like an early Internet Explorer attempt at it that got abandoned.
Sweet.
Display flex box. No, that's. Here's the guide. Let's see. Nope. Flex box versus flex. Oops. Here we go. Yep. There we go. Earlier versions.
Perfect.
Yeah, that was one that thrashed pretty hard. So thrashing is when something changes a lot. And like we had to do this awful stuff at the time where like you had to do these for every browser to like turn on that browser's version of Flexbox. It sucked. Super standardized now though.
So for Flex, and it's in Grid as well, you could put an order on each of the children, each of those boxes to switch them around. To me, it just doesn't seem practical. For the readability, if someone is going through and reading your code, they'll look at the HTML and see the order that things are in, and then they look at the page and it's all flipped around. Is there, to me, it seems easier just to put them in the right order first and then do your styling. So like, what is the practical use of that tool?
Sure. Oh, I use the order property all the time. So what we're talking about is, okay, so this pink one, the red block here, this is the first one on here. You can also override it so that, no, I want it to be the fifth one. And if I save that, like you can just change the order. So the practical use of that is that it's not like we're doing half the work for a layout in the HTML file and half the work in the CSS file. They do different things. So the HTML, in a perfect world, it like does not know how it will be styled, does not care. This is just the content, irrespective of any presentation. So a good test for that would be, could you put a completely different style sheet on it without changing any of the HTML and go for like a radically different look? And like to wit, I did exactly that once. Where like, is this site even still up? Nope, it is not. Yikes.
I was going to tell you, you had a broken link on your personal website that links exactly here.
Oh, no, that's too bad. So this is a company I used to own. Well, I guess I still technically own it, but we haven't made any money in 2.5 years, so I did not put a whole lot of effort into renewing it. But anyway, so that was a conference, and every year we had like a different theme for the conference. All we did was change out the style sheets. The sites looked nothing alike, but the content was the same. And so using things like the order property, you can reorder stuff and keep it semantically the order that it should be in the index.html. But then, I don't know, we had goofy, wacky designers and stuff that liked stuff all over the place. And so we could use the styling for that. So it's not a thing that I would go nuts on or anything, but like another great example would be semantically sort of makes sense like this, but we do it one way in desktop and the other one in mobile. So you can have an order that is one way by default and then a different order at like at a media query breakpoint, for example.
So we had like, I'm guessing this is something JavaScript would be better at, but like if you go to like to Bethany's Pie Shop and say you had like the 5 top pies, which Bethany is drove me nuts, but would that be something you could use CSS to like, oh, you know, DoorDash shows you these are our top 3 dishes right now. Would that be something, or would you use something like JavaScript to go and change kind of consistently?
That would be JavaScript.
Okay. It seems like a lot of work to go in and consistently change, but thought I'd ask.
So Here's like an example of where you might write it one way in HTML, but display it a little bit differently. So let's say you had like an ordered list that was some kind of ranked thing. Oops. But the way that you wanted to display it was like A, and then a slightly smaller B, C, D, E. Something like that, where it's a mostly visual effect, but the priority order of that is like this. You might write it this way in the HTML and then use the order to style it like that. I can see that. Other questions about Flex? So the same concept with grid, where we have containers and children. There's 2 steps to grid. So if I've got like these items here, even more so than Flex, the items inside of a grid container don't necessarily need to have any particular relationship with their semantic order in your HTML, because you have to like physically place each one anyway. So why not? Write it in the way that makes sense to just read it top to bottom in your document, and then use grid to put them in whatever wacky pattern you want. But the gist of it is, step 1 is define the grid. Step 2 is place items on the grid. And there's a lot of different ways you can do this. And I think that that's like what maybe trips people up about things like Grid Garden. So if you want like a simple ass way to define grids, here's my strategy. For step 1, you need display grid, grid template rows, and columns. And then that's really all you need to define a grid. To place something on a grid, your like foolproof thing for this is grid row. Like, what's the line? And then how many cells should it cross? And then same thing with the column. What line does it start on? How many does it cross? Or how many cells does it take up? That's it. That's really all. Like, you can do way more things. Like you can do grid areas, which are kind of neat because you can visualize sort of how the grid works in CSS. If you want something easy to get started with that will work for the rest of your grid defining career, it's just that. And then when you're defining the rows and columns, I've seen like people mess this up. It's not the number of columns. So like this isn't 2. It's more like, well, I want the first row to just be however much the content makes it. And then I want another row that takes up all the rest of the space in the container. Or I want 2 evenly spaced columns. They should be exactly the same size. Or I want this one to be exactly 200 pixels. I want this one to be determined by the content, and then I want this other one to take up all the remaining space. So it's sizes that you use for when you're defining something. And then you use grid lines when you're placing it on the grid. Ta-da! That's it.
That was way easier than GridGuard made it. And so when you say grid lines, and I think that's what kind of got me confused. It's like the first grid line is the second grid line type thing, and then it's literally the lines, right?
Correct. So let me pull up a grid example.
And there's a dev tool you can use, and it like lays it out for you, makes it really easy to see your grid lines.
Yeah.
You know what it is?
It's just in your dev tools.
Yeah.
If you have something defined as a grid, you can like click the button that'll say grid, and it'll show you.
You are correct. So I'm gonna make a sandbox for this. I sworn I did that already, but by the way, so what I'm doing here, I have this repo. If you want to play with a repo in Code Sandbox, I'll start over. So go over to Code Sandbox, go create sandbox, and then import project, this like last option. Throw in any public GitHub URL. It'll even make a pretty good guess at what language and all that sort of stuff that it needs to set up for you. And there we go. Okay, so I've got a grid here to wit. If I element inspect this, let's check out that, that grid line tool. Okay, so the grid container is here. If I click that and turn it on, that's the grid. It's 3 rows, 3 columns, and then this like kind of hashed out area is called a gutter or a column gap. So if I'm counting lines, this one over on the left is line 1. This big fat one is line 2, line 3, line 4. If this first one, so this is the red box, let's say I want it to overlap the green box and go all the way to that other one. Well, right now it starts on grid column 1 and spans 1 cell. If I make it span 2 cells. All right, now it's like overlapping with that. And I can, if I put like a transparency layer, like an alpha channel on those, do 0.5, 0.5, save it. Hey, we can see the overlap now. If I want that red one to take up everything, all right, well, it starts on column 1, spans 2 columns. How do I make, say, span 3 cells? I want this to start on row 1, and I want it to span 3 cells. So now it takes up all of it. If I want it to be on top of everything, it's like underneath everything right now, give it a Z index. Now it's on top of everything. Now it's back under. Now it is spanning 2 different rows, only spanning 1 column. That's grid.
Is there like an inherent property for the Z index where if it's overlapping, it's automatically going to go under, whereas the smaller ones will go over?
Nope. It has to do with the order that they're in here. So
Okay.
This one will be the bottom one, then that'll be the top one, or that one will go on top of it. Third one goes on top of that. This one goes on top of everything by default. It's called a stacking context. And generally, you only need to worry about a stacking context if you want things to overlap. And that actually doesn't happen as much as you might think. By But like I made that one z-index 10. You could make it 1. If it has any positive value, it'll go on top of everything else. The advantage of having it be something like 10 is if you do end up needing to make like a cheeseburger of this stuff, you've got a little bit of wiggle room in there. Questions about this? Okay, this is grid overview, grid or flex, container versus item. It is also effectively your macro layout. So when you're getting started and you're doing these big, the biggest blocks that you have, worth figuring out, is this something that I could put on a grid? Is this something that is just a collection of things that I want a little bit more control over how they're spaced out and centered and that sort of stuff than I normally have with inline and block? Now, another thing, this is something I see people screw up all the time when they're doing either of these layouts. So if you want to do this layout here, that means the green box is a grid container, and then this grid container needs to have exactly 4 children. It can't have 5 children. It can't have 25 children. It can't have 3 children. It can't have 1 child. These can't be nested inside of each other. Each of these needs to be a discrete element, and like the green box needs to have exactly 4 children. That one throws people off when they're learning this.
That being said, if you wanted the grid to have 25 children, that is possible. Right?
Totally.
If you wanted to make the layout
absolutely
25.
You just
okay, cool.
But you need to place all of those on the grid.
That sounds like a lot.
All right, here's what I want you to do. I want you to take 5 minutes. I'm going to send you this sandbox I just made. It is in Zoom chat right now. I am putting 5 minutes on the clock. Just play with it. See if, like, if you move these things around, do they do the thing that you think that they're doing? See if you can guess what'll happen when you tweak these values. Just play a little bit. 5 minutes on the clock. Go for it. You can add rows, add columns. Do whatever you want. One more minute. All right. So before we move on, questions about that? Anything come up while you were working through grid stuff?
Yeah, your template setup here says repeat and then it has 2 values. So does that mean that it goes on indefinitely? Because what I was able to do is create, say, in the second child, I put in just for giggles 8 and it pushed it all the way over to the side.
Mm-hmm.
So rather than its inherent looking like it only has a couple of columns, does that repeat value mean that it just goes forever?
So this is exactly the same as if I did like that. Those mean the same thing. It's just a little bit cleaner.
I see.
So I guess, does that mean then if you expand an item, like if you expanded that second square, that second child outside of the grid,
Ooh, there's a
3 or
question.
8, I guess what Sean said, he gave it like a span of 8. Will it always just take up the remaining space on the page?
No, it what it does is it adds another column. So anytime you do that, it goes, oh, I guess you've made a mistake here. And then it tries to accommodate that as best it can. So if we take a look at the grid on this now, there'll be another column there. But we didn't specify how big it should be. So it just makes a guess. Versus if I did that and then 20 pixels. Then see how it just kind of nudges out just a little bit. Other questions? Observations? Things that came up?
I think the most confusing part is really the way it's laid out in the actual container. That, I mean, the columns and rows, the numbers, I'm having like the hardest time wrapping my head around the way it's defined up there. And I get it, like the MDN reference I felt like was a little bit better than the one from earlier, but it just seems contrary to what I would imagine it would be.
Or is the issue that you're thinking of the grid column as like the
that part I get, the one where you're laying out the children. It's the actual container, the repeat, and I understand what it's saying, but that's where it's like the application or.
Got it.
Yeah.
So it might be helpful whenever you're doing a grid to just draw it, like on a whiteboard or on paper or something first. So you go, all right, well, I want to do this 3x3 grid. So what does that look like? And then draw it out. And then the thing that you need to make choices about when you're defining that is what determines the size of these things. If it's, I don't know, just the content, I guess, that's auto. If it should take up as much space as possible, or it should be relative to some other row or column, that's a fractional unit. Otherwise, you can use a fixed size. and go, no matter what, this column or row should always be 100 pixels, or it should be just whatever the content makes it, or it should be either take up all the remaining space or be relative to something else. So like, for example, if I go back over here, instead of repeating this, I could do something like 100 pixels and auto, or actually I'll do 1 FR and 2 FR. So that means that this third row, the first row is going to be 100 pixels, and then these are going to take up all the remaining space, but the third one will be twice as big as the second one. So that'll look like this. So if I turn the grid inspector on, there you go. That's 100 pixels. This is twice as big as this. I'll also make it 3 times as big.
This is maybe not the best question in the world, but why doesn't the grid gap interfere with our content?
Why is like something able to stretch over a grid gap?
Yeah.
Because that's how it works in newspaper grids. Like with these these grid systems, this is like isn't like a CSS thing. This is a design thing that goes back like 500 years. And so if you work for a magazine or a newspaper, or you're a monk and like you're making a poster in the Old West or something like that, grids are like probably one of the most bedrock tools that designers work with. And the idea of a gutter, like that's a standard part of this. And when you're placing something on a design grid and you have it take up more than one cell, it always crosses the gutter.
Thank you.
Can we go back to where you said you must have as many children as the grid? Can you,
Totally.
so looking at this, this says you should have 9 boxes on your grid, right? And you're filling up 4. That part makes sense, but
Okay.
we don't have 9 children.
Sure.
So that you must fill up the grid? Or
like there's 1, 2, 3, 4 boxes on this. Even though there's 9 cells, like the boxes can take up more than one cell, that's fine. But I still have the same number of children as I do like units of content on the grid.
and that's just based on how you're filling them with their spans, et cetera.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, like I didn't get this done, but I did want to have a topic article on like the design part of grids, completely absent of CSS stuff. But if you look like magazine grid layout, this is what like a true design grid looks like. They do it with books, all kinds of different stuff. And there's famous grids where like the gap on the sides and all this stuff are a particular proportion. I even have, hang on. Shoot, come on. Oh, I can't find it. I have a notebook of like, I drew all of the famous grids to like see how they're derived. It's kind of interesting. And the one that they use in newspapers is called a modular grid. Looks like this. But yeah,
I mean, it makes sense to do everything that way. It's like, how much different is a website than say like a magazine where you want things to be, maybe that's COCD in me, but.
So here's the problem. Like a magazine is a fixed size. A viewport is not. So like that fights that just a little bit. Also, it's a little bit limiting. So like when you're doing content, yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense to lay this out in a grid. Or even like the macro layout of an application. But if you look at like non-grid layouts, like the most creative stuff doesn't use a grid. So they both have a place. Or, oh man, there's one that there's a graphic that I really like. I can never find it, but it's like, basically some graphic designer who it's a comic, and they submit this cool design with all these wacky angles and overlapping things. And then the web dev gets it and turns it into every single Bootstrap site. Like that, and then the 3 things here. Same thing you were doing in your group projects. And so over-gridding things can kind of turn like a really cool creative design into something undifferentiated. Other questions about grids? Cool. So I want to shift over to the last tool in our basic layout toolbox, which is positioning. So positioning is like, that's probably the one that people get the most scared of in CSS. I think it's generally explained pretty poorly, and people make it more complicated than it needs to be. The idea of positioning is, I do not want this to have any like weight in the document. I want to manually place where it goes. And since a viewport is not a fixed size, it always needs to be relative to something. You want to specifically place this relative to the document, relative to another element, but otherwise that's it. So like, you might have, this is the entire document. Maybe you say, I want to put something in the lower right corner, like let's say a toast message on an LMS. Those are all absolutely positioned. Or maybe you want something, you have other elements in here, and you want to put a little red X, and you just want it to be in the upper right corner. You would absolutely position that relative to the green box. That's pretty much everything you need to know about positioning. When you absolutely position something, it will look for its nearest relative ancestor or just the entire document. And then it will be placed however many pixels away from whatever thing that you say. So like the CSS properties top, left, right, and bottom, they only apply to absolutely positioned elements. And that's how you absolutely position them. An example. Let's go back over to this grid. Let's say I wanted to absolutely position some content inside one of these grid cells. So I could go over here, and instead of a non-breaking space, I do something like put another element. It's a span, and it's what we used to call an emoticon. Oops. All right, so now that has some content in it. Now, ordinarily, it's going to follow our same document flow rules. It's inline content, so it's going to go left to right. If I got a whole bunch of them, they work just like text. Now, let's say I want to just totally take this out of the document flow and absolutely position it. So I could call this emoticon, like that. And then target it. Was that a ID or a class? It was an ID. So if I set a position for this, like as soon as I save this, it's probably going to fly to the upper right or upper left corner of the page because it no longer has any weight. It is no longer constrained by anything, and its nearest relative neighbor is the entire document. So it's just going to throw it up there until I put it somewhere else. So I save that. Oh, didn't move it. Do I have a relative position on this? Maybe not. Did it actually take the style? That's another good question.
Is it because it was in that child?
Yeah, it should ignore that. Let's see. What if
position absolute work on a flex item?
Oh, good question. Is emoticon a flex item?
No, but you could make it.
I could. But
a span is an inline item, isn't it?
It is, and it's inside of this grid item, which means that the grid has nothing to do with that. Anything that we do inside of one of these grid cells has nothing to do with grids anymore. We could make it. We could make this grid item also a grid container.
Is a grid in and of itself not absolute? That was my question. Like, can you put a relative item? I mean, it has to be inside of a relative item, right? An absolute item?
An absolute item should be inside of a relative one. It has some like resolution rules for like if you don't do that. But if I make the body its nearest relative ancestor, let's see what happens. Did it do it? Nope. What if I make it, see, this is in the second one. Yeah. Maybe we're learning something. Okay, so if I put that in there and then set the right of this to 0. There we go. Now I'm positioning. If I set the bottom of it to 0, I can put it wherever I want. Put it in the bottom right. If I don't want it to be in like right up against the edge, you can put any value there. I want it to be 20 pixels from the top. Comes 20 pixels down from the top. I make this 20 pixels from the right. Comes in a little bit. These could be like things like M's. Be 2 M's from the top. It could be viewport units. It could be any sort of CSS unit you can use to absolutely position something. 50%. Doesn't quite do what you might think it does, but like you might think doing top 50% and right 50% centers it. It does not, because it has to do with like where these things start. So like that actually starts 50% from the right, and then it keeps going. It's not quite the same as centering. But if I want to absolutely position something, that's how I can do it.
So if you take out the relative on it, what happens on the child?
So if I take that, so that is its parent, just to be clear.
Oh, I mean, yeah, sorry, I mean, of the child in the grid. Oh, but the grid doesn't matter. I forgot about that.
Exactly. Check that out.
So why did it do that to begin with?
Because I hadn't absolutely positioned it anywhere, maybe. So
okay.
like, yeah. So if
that was the only part I was still confused on.
I kind of was too. So it's probably just because I didn't actually absolutely position it. So it's there, and then if I say top 0, It does it relative to the document. So sends it down to the bottom of the page, right of the page. So now it's down there in the corner. And then if I want to make that relative to that box, uncomment that out. Now it's relative to the box.
Could you also make the yellow box a flex box itself and
Totally.
then do very similar things that you're doing now? Cool.
Yes, but it wouldn't, if I've absolutely positioned this, flex wouldn't affect it anymore.
Right.
So just so I'm clear, you always, when you're doing the positioning, it's kind of like the flex or a grid. You have your container, which is position relative, and your item, which is position absolute, and then you can use those to kind of move it around. And if you don't have a container with the position relative, it's just going to take it the body on or the document on as a whole.
Correct. Now the thing that's different from flex container or like containers and items with flex and grid does not need to be your immediate parent. It can be anything in your ancestry. Great grandparent, whatever. It still needs to be in that like family tree, but anywhere in there can be what you're positioning relative to.
But it's always got to be relative then absolute.
Yes.
Okay. I think I was trying to mess with that on my website pre-work project, and I had no stinking clue what I was doing.
A thing that throws people off about absolute positioning a lot is, I've mentioned, like once something is absolutely positioned, it doesn't have weight anymore. So that's in the upper left corner of this box. If I put something else in there, think to yourself, what's going to happen? Keep it to yourself. So I'm going to put a block element in here. So that should like push the span down. I'm going to put some content goes here inside of that. So think about what you think is going to happen when I save this, and then let's see if you're right. Ooh, snap. It did push it down. Shouldn't have. I was surprised by that one. I was kind of expecting it to go right on top. Let's see what's going on there. Yep. Ah, it's twitchy. Yeah, that should go right on top of that. I wonder if I flip the order of these, if that makes a difference.
It's got to do with the emoticon, right? Is there something that...
Huh, yeah, I would expect it to not take up any space, so it shouldn't be able to push that paragraph down. It is absolutely positioned.
But it's treating it like a block.
Oh, no, this is working totally correctly. Take a look at what's happening to the paragraph. I don't know if you can probably barely see it over Zoom. It's the padding. So if I do padding 0, margin 0, there we go. Now they're overlapping. The padding from the paragraph was pushing it down. So now they're overlapping. It should work the other way too.
Was that set in the CSS?
That was not, I believe, set in the CSS because it didn't show up here. It's probably just the default, the user agent style sheet. For
Gotcha.
those.
So if you pasted that
Gotcha.
one that we had yesterday, it would eliminate all of that and do what you would expect.
A
Exactly.
nice binary set.
Okay.
But yeah, now that one I kind of get. So unless it maybe just didn't take the style again. Oh no, just blew it out because I moved it. There we go. So, absolutely positioning something is not something you should do a lot. If you find yourself just absolutely positioning the crap out of stuff, you're probably not doing it right. But things like that button, that's like a standard use case for absolute positioning. So it's not never use it. You're not in trouble for using it. If you're using it a lot, that smells bad. Probably means that you'd be better off using other kinds of layout. Or like another example of absolute positioning is on my personal site. When I scroll down, as me yelling all of those things, all of those are absolutely positioned. There's just some big container that's around me. There we go. That's the container. See, I have a position relative on that. And then each of these speech bubbles is absolutely positioned relative to something and then rotated and stuff. Cool, that's positioning. Biggest takeaway you could probably have from that is when you use grid or flexbox or whatever to do your macro layout, each of these boxes, you can even think of it practically as a new document. That's the tool that we use for decomposing our problems. So whatever we did with flex and grid and whatever, it doesn't keep getting passed down unless we explicitly do that. Because you could also turn each of these into a grid or a flex or whatever you want to, but like you have to keep doing that if you want it to work that way. Otherwise, that's just a smaller box that you're working with now. Okay, back over here. Real quick, how much can you nest these? As much as you care to. There is no limit to how many children something could have, how many flex boxes can be inside something, how deeply you can nest grids. Totally up to you. Box model breakdown. Let's talk about that. So box model, content, padding, border, margin. So when you set height and width, that's content. By default, if you read the thing about box sizing border box, height and width also includes the padding in the border too. But right out of the box, content is the width and height. Padding, border, margin. If you don't have a border, then this doesn't take up any space. The easiest way to tell the difference between padding and margin, if this had a background color, the padding would include it, the margin would not. So you use margin to push things away from other things. Use padding to make the size of the thing bigger. If something, whether or not it does, if it did have a background color, would it apply to the thing that you're making bigger? That's padding. Otherwise, it's margin. So going back over here, if I highlight this, if this had a background color on the text, would it take up all of this space between here and the little navigation thing down here? Would all of that have the background color? Probably not. It'd probably be either just this or maybe just a teeny bit more of that would have this background color, just like this orange highlight right now. So that would be padding. And then the space between this and the header, or this and this navigation bar, that's margin. Now this is a great example. How when I hover over it, it changes the highlight color. So that means that the stuff around that, that's padding, because it would all have that color. So this line, this like LI or whatever that is a part of this, all of that is padding inside of there. Questions about that?
Thank the Lord. You explained it so succinctly.
Hey!
Because this has been tripping me up, and I've never known which one to use between padding or margin. So thank you.
Excellent.
It makes perfect sense now.
Good. And yeah, and then the border would be in between those. If you had a background color on something, the border would be at the edge of that background.
So if you set the height to something and then you implement some kind of padding, would that actually take the height and then add padding to it, or would the padding be included in that height?
Yes, and that's a problem. Like, that drives everyone insane when they're learning CSS. So check this out.
I think this is my problem.
Yeah, I'm with you, man.
So down here, let's say I do div some box model thing. And inside here, I have some content. I'm going to get rid of my emoticon. Go back to the non-breaking space. Okay, so I've got some content down here. If I set, so this some box model thing, if I set the width of this to 100%, I'll give it a background color too. I'll pinch this green one. Oops, nope. Not what I wanted. Come on, man. Don't make me look dumb in front of my friends. 160, 50, 80%. All right, cool. So that's got that thing there. I want to push it away from that box that's above it a little bit. If I do that with padding, like padding top 20 pixels, keeps the background. I change that to margin top, doesn't keep the background, but still like taking up that whole line or whatever. So if I put some padding on this also, I put 20 pixels of padding. So that should get 20 pixels of like extra green border around all that. Awesome, doing good so far. If I set the width of this to 100%, watch what breaks. Womp womp. Now I have these horizontal scroll bars. What the hell? It's because that was 100%, this content, and then you added 20 pixels on either side of that of padding. That is basically what nobody means when they say they want something to be 100%, right?
So if you just made it the padding is for top and bottom, would that unbreak it because it doesn't have the left and right added?
Oh, watch what happens when we do that. Because now we have the problem of like, well, I still want it to have that stuff on the side. So if I did padding on top and bottom and nothing on the sides, well, that's not quite what I wanted either. I didn't want the content to go right up to the edge like that. So there's no way you would guess this. This is one of these stupid CSS things that you just have to memorize. There's a property called box sizing. It defaults to content box. That's what we're doing right now. You set something 100%. I got these stupid scroll bars here. If you set this to border box, it does the thing that you think it should do.
Well, this was driving us crazy with our website with the nav bar, trying to get things spaced the way we wanted, but the margin versus padding.
Yep. Box size.
So the margin's like separating it from something else, and the padding's like adding weight.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So in our sum box model thing, just for giggles and seeing, can we have all these standards and then set a width at 20 pixels to see what happens?
Yeah.
Or a height, excuse me.
Sure.
Set a height at 20 pixels.
So what probably happened there, actually, let's make it even smaller. Let's make it like 2 pixels. See what happens.
Well, you have a margin on top and not on bottom, right?
That's pushing it away from these things. That's not this green part.
Or the padding. You have a padding on. Oh, no, the padding's all the way around. Interesting.
Right. What's happening there? So if we element inspect it, okay, that's the thing there. So what we're seeing, the reason it's purple, if you go over to layout, that tells you how many pixels it's calculated all these things to be. So that purple is this purple. It's 20 pixels on every side. So that means you can even see the dimensions. I can't move my mouse to hover it, where it says div.SumBoxModel thing 766 by 40. 40 is the 20 pixels on top and 20 pixels on bottom of padding. But since I said that the height of it, which should include the padding, should be 2 pixels, it doesn't know how to reconcile those. So what it does is, you can see down in the corner here, it just got rid of the content. But rather than hide this, it just pushed it out of the container. So this is your browser doing its best job to do something impossible. More questions about the box model?
So if you wanted the sum content box to only take up the same space that the grid is, would you just set the width and adjust until you get there, or is there a quicker way to figure out exactly how wide that would be?
So the best way to do that is, if this should only go to the edge of this box, both of those should be in the same container. That's that wide. So like right now, the grid container is 300 pixels wide, because that's how many things there are. So you could do 300 pixels for the width on this. I think that's kind of sloppy. And I'll show you why. For one, things like that happen because we're still using border box. I changed that back to content box. All right, now it's kind of in the ballpark, but like that's like not even really, because that's probably not taking into account the maybe it was border box, and we need to also account for the grid gap. Yeah, so there's 2 grid gaps in there, so it's actually 348 pixels. So you might be starting to see why I think this is a sloppy way to do this. There we go. Now it's the same size for now. And then as I'm adjusting this and I go, the grid gap's a little too big. What if I knock that down to 20? Oh no, now this thing doesn't line up anymore. Like, so as you start tweaking the design, like it can't handle modification. That's a problem. So a better way to handle that same problem is just to make them both a part of the same container. And so then instead of doing something like this, say, I could say, all right, I'm going to add a wrapper. So this is like some wrapper that both of them are in. Okay, and now I'm going to set the width of some wrapper. So some wrapper is 350 pixels wide. And then instead of setting like this for the columns, the hard-coded width, make that all 1 FR. It's going to stretch out a little bit. And then instead of hard coding the width on this, just make that 100%. So now, as I'm tweaking this design and editing stuff, and I go, never mind, I want the grid gap to be 48 pixels. It all stays proportional. Or I say, I want, go ahead.
It looked like it auto-adjusted when you added the wrapper before you put the width in there.
I don't know. Maybe. But the general principle behind this is instead of setting all of these individual things to specific sizes and then hoping that you remember to change all of those when you change one of them, have like some shared ancestor, constrain that, and then use relative units within that. Way better.
Setting up that wrapper, you didn't even need to make your sum content box a part of the grid. You kept it as a flex box.
Correct.
And it just, that's cool.
And so then, so the other change that I did is instead of hard coding 100 pixels for each of those columns, I'm using that to determine the size and then saying, cut it into 3.
I think this is the issue that I was running into because I was trying to figure out how do you reconcile, okay, I want to style this item this way and this other item, have it the same width, but I want a whole different set of properties to it. So you put them both in the same container so that way they can still have their separate properties, but they, okay, there we go. Light bulbs are going off.
All right, Chris, I think you found the beat. Love it. Other questions about the box model? All right, last thing. Maybe we'll get to all this. All right, let's talk about alignment. So some rules about alignment. It's not actually true, but act as if it is, and you'll have a fine life. You cannot align things vertically. Flexbox. Gotta have a flex the container and then use something like align items to get it in the middle. There's no other reasonable way to do that. Like doing stuff left to right, you actually have a couple tools for that. So one of them, also Flexbox. You can also center things that way. Totally reasonable. What text align center is for is if you have a block element and you have inline children. So maybe this is a div. And maybe this is an image. Images are inline elements. If you do text align center on that, that'll center the image in there. Because the image is a inline element, so ordinarily it would be like over here. But if we tell the div, hey, all your inline children, why don't you center them? That'll work. You could also flex that. It would work the exact same way. If we made the block display flex and then justify content center, that does the same thing. What like text align is actually for though is if you take a block level element like a P and you want to center the text inside of it, like a wedding invitation. That's text align center. The problem that I see people run into the most with this is maybe P is a flex item or something and isn't taking up all of the width, because that text is centered inside the paragraph. If the paragraph looks like this and it's just the size of the text content, guess what? That is centered. You won't see that until you element inspect it and see that the P tag isn't taking up the entire width. I've seen that one a couple thousand times at this point. Those are the biggest alignment problems that people have.
So with that, is it just like wasted command to put that in, or is there a problem?
So yeah,
if
if you text align center on this, it just won't do anything. So you need to make that P take up as much width as you want it to, like 100%, for example, and then try to center it this way.
Okay.
When you're trying to center elements inside of other elements, though, flex is probably a better tool. There's some other tricks you can do with like margin and stuff. Just flex it. If you want like one thing to remember, flex centers elements inside of other elements. Text align center is more for you want to have like a bunch of content that looks like this, like a menu or a wedding invitation or something like that.
This might jump ahead, and if it is, just disregard it. When is it that we would choose to use float?
No, that is a great question. And this dovetails with this last thing on here about best practices. Do not use floats or tables for layout. I know that was going around a little bit during the project. I think it was in your pre-work also.
Yeah, they did float left for the sidebar.
People have been teaching web layout using floats since like 1995, and absolutely nobody should be doing that in the year of our Lord 2022. Those were always hacks, and they have so many problems with doing them that way, because floated content also, it's like absolutely positioned content. It doesn't have any weight, and so it's so hard to do a layout that way. You have to know exactly how wide things are going to be so that you can like margin them out so they cross each other. Terrible way to do it. Tables also have a similar problem where remember, our HTML elements we don't do those because of how it will look. And so using like the whole table system for layout breaks that. Now, tables have a place. floats have a place, it's not don't use floats or tables, it's don't use them for layout. Use flex, grid, inline, block, positioning. Do layout with those. Floats are specifically for, like, you have an article or something, and the content goes like this, and then there's an image that's part of that content that the text should flow around.
Someone needs to talk to Pluralsight because that's all they taught.
Yep. That.
and the table.
Yep.
Craig Shoemaker led us astray.
That's when you use a float.
Matt can attest to this. So we were doing our group project, and I kept trying to use float to get it. We eventually got to the flex, but I kept trying to use float, and it'd have content, and then the float would make it go right there in the middle between our two boxes. It was so annoying.
Yep. This is the only use case for float, is wrapping content around something like this. Yep. The use case for tables is for tabular data, where, think like spreadsheet kind of stuff, where the data is best represented as like rows and columns. An example of that y'all see, this is a table. It's got headings and things that match up with those headings. Anything that you might filter or sort, that's like pretty reasonably a table. That's what those are for. Tables for tabular data, floats for flowing content around another element. Not layout.
Not Bethany's pie shop menu.
But no, that's not just a weird Pluralsight thing. That is like how it's like 30 years of people thinking that it's really important to learn float layouts. And I have been unsuccessful in convincing the entire world to stop doing that. And like if this happens a lot of enterprises, if you're like, Old Man Coverly told us to not use floats and tables for layouts, and somebody at Ford is like, oh, no, we got to use that. The reason we have to use floats is they have better browser support. You can go over to caniuse.com and say, can I use grid? I see fields of green, red roses too. But all this stuff in green, you're good to go on this. Opera Mini supports absolutely nothing. There's like, that's the whole point of it, is that Opera Mini like has no features. Baidu browser, same thing. These IEs stopped being supported forever ago. This IE 11 was released 9 years ago. These Edge versions, these are 5 years old. Browsers are free, man. And like, even this isn't even like a no. You just have to prefix it. There's and Flex, same thing. There's no reason that anybody should not be using Flex. Even Opera Mini supports Flex.
All of this explains why we had such a hard time, I think, in general, getting the pages to lay out when we were working on it, why it took so long.
Yep.
It's because we were doing what we were taught, but it was wrong. And it was impossible.
It's not impossible. Anything you can, well, that's not true.
Oh, well, we made it work. It was just harder than it should have been.
Way harder than it should have been. So consider this the layout New Testament. Like, use these tools from now on. Don't use floats or tables.
Thank you. Because I feel like a lot of us did like some Frankenstein approach, and like if it lived, hell yeah, we're going somewhere. But if it didn't, we're just like, you know.
Yeah.
So,
that's why I asked, because it's like it was too hard for what it wound up being.
There you go. Better tools now.
The tools.
And like, as far as like best practices and shit, those are the biggest ones. Don't use tables and floats for layout. The only other like really broad things I'd say to keep in mind, be really careful about adding elements just for styling purposes. It's not, you should never do that, but it's another one like where if you find yourself adding a lot of HTML elements just to style something, you're probably not doing it right. Because when you look at these like different layout things, you go, all right, well, I'm going to do a layout like this. Why? Like, none of this is arbitrary. Like visual design isn't just like, make it look pretty. This has nothing to do with design. Design is about function. It is about like, what content needs to be communicated and how do we make the stuff that people are trying to find as easy to find as possible. So if that's this layout, like what are those things called? Then they should probably be wrapped in some kind of element that's named that. And so if you are unable to come up with a name for like what something is in there, you might not understand what function that piece is serving in the design well enough. So like throwing wrappers around stuff, sometimes you just have to. Like for example, that on my personal site, that little quote explosion thing, this is weird. Like I had to put a wrapper around that to make any of this work because I'm doing hacky CSS stuff. But like that's when something should get a wrapper. Most of the time, you should be able to come up with like a really good semantic reason why something has the elements that it does. Those are my 3 big guidelines. No floats for layout, no tables for layouts. Be cautious about adding an element that does nothing but help you style something. And I believe that is Coach Kyle's most misunderstood topic of the week. Any last questions?